Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for coming out on a lovely spring evening. We often think that perhaps we go on too long with the Winter Talks programmes into the middle of March, but maybe the weather is indicating this. Sorry, am I a bit loud?
Yes. No, you're okay.
I'm okay.
Oh, sure.
Well, yeah, thanks for coming out. And this is our grand finale for this year, the last talk of the season. I'm delighted to have Dr. Helen Sen with us from the Highland Wildlife Park to come and talk about the Wildcat project that they have there, Saving Wildcats, which is a really important initiative and a fascinating one. Just having a quick look through the presentation earlier, I was just amazed by the depth and spread of the project. So I think we're in for a fascinating and really interesting evening. So Dr. Sen is head of conservation and science, I think, with the RZSS, and that involves responsibility for 23 endangered species, including the wildcat. So that seems to be a fairly impressive spread. And whether she'll touch on any of the other areas of her portfolio, I don't know, but certainly the focus will be on the Scottish Wildcats. And it's very timely given the proposals to reintroduce the wildcats into the national park in various locations. So I'm sure we'll all be intrigued to hear more about that part of the programme. So that's more than enough from me. Can I welcome Helen? Thank you very much for coming along, and over to you.
You can hear me. Well, thank you so much, Mike, for that introduction, and thank you for the invite to come and speak here. It's lovely to be here. So my name's Helen Sen. I'm head of conservation and science at RZSS. It's a bit of a mouthful. It's the charity that owns Highland Wildlife Park and Edinburgh Zoo. And I've actually worked at RZSS for 12 years now, and I think I've worked on wildcats in some shape or form for pretty much the whole time that I've been at RZSS. Initially, I was involved in the genetics lab that's down at Edinburgh Zoo, and that's really how I got into working on wildcats. But for the last 5 years, or 4 and a bit years, I've been head of conservation, and so wildcats, kind of all of our remit on wildcats has come under my watch. And as Mike alluded to, we do actually work on a bunch of different species, both in Scotland and around the world. And we're lucky enough to work on a couple of other different reintroduction projects, including the reintroduction of scimitar-horned oryx to Chad, which is an extinct in the wild antelope species, and the critically endangered Siamese crocodile in Cambodia. And we've been involved in beaver reintroductions, and here in the Strath as well, on the pine hoverfly and the dark-bordered beauty moth, in partnership with many other people. So it's really great to be able to bring some of that learning from some of the other projects to this project on wildcats. And wildcats is certainly one of our biggest conservation projects that we run. And I guess I'm very fortunate to be in the position of being the project lead for that project. But as you'll see, it's a huge team effort. And that's really one of the takeaway messages I want to give with this talk, is that it takes a village to recover a species, hopefully. And there's really lots and lots of people that have contributed to the presentation that I'm giving today. So this is a beautiful picture of a wildcat, which is actually taken by pecans. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, and I love it because it's a very romantic view. It's walking through the snow. It's got beautiful green eyes, but lots of you have probably seen this exact picture actually probably reproduced quite a lot of times, and that's because fundamentally there's not that many wildcats out there. And sort of underneath this lovely romantic view is the sort of horrible statistics, which as a scientist I love. And that is that wildcats are really not doing well at all. So they are Britain's last wild living felid. We can kind of try to put estimates on it. We say that there's something like less than 115 individuals in the wild. You'll find out in a moment why that's particularly complicated, but it's complicated by hybridization. Or crossbreeding with domestic cats, which is a big threat. But there's also lots of other threats, and particularly persecution threat remains high. In captivity, there's actually 150 wildcats at the moment, and I suppose what that means is that, for better or worse, that's part of the solution is recovering the population with captive breeding individuals. And this is a recognised tool by the International Union of the Conservation of Nature. What I should add is it's never our preferred route to recovering a population. Once things get to this stage, it's, a minute to midnight for a species. And what you'll see is that it takes a lot of preparation in order to try and row back from that minute to midnight. And that's, I guess, what we're trying to do with this project. And just a little bit of an outline of the talk. I'm really going to talk to you about wildcats in the past, present and future. How have we got to where we are today and where are we going? And I think over the years, you've probably had quite a few different people come and talk about wildcat conservation here, and you'll be aware of lots of different projects. And what I want to try and do is maybe give a sense of how that all relates to each other as well, and the sort of trajectory that we're hopefully heading on, the upwards trajectory that we're now hopefully heading on. So this is just a couple of pictures of the lovely wildcat. And wildcats arrived in Britain after the last ice age, so around 8,000 to 9,000 years ago. They're classed as a subpopulation of the European wildcat, Felis sylvestris, which is found throughout Europe, but not in Scandinavia, which is interesting because what it does is it makes our wildcats the most northerly population of European wildcat in the world. The European wildcat is a different species to the domestic cat, Felis catus, which was domesticated in turn from the North African wildcat, Felis libica. And give or take, there's about 1 million years of evolutionary history between the two species. So they share a common ancestor, and therefore they can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. And hybridization like this is not uncommon within mammal species. But obviously we've got a situation where domestic cats have been moved to Britain, and now they're interbreeding. In nature, it's a tabby-coloured small cat with a thick, bushy, blunt tail and rings and a black tip. And the wildcats are mainly solitary, except during the breeding season, and they're active around dawn and dusk. They're crepuscular animals and at night. And perhaps it's really important to start with, what's good for wildcats, and that is fundamentally good wildcat habitat. And what's really important to note is that wildcats are considered to be habitat generalists, and they prefer a patchwork or mosaic of habitat types, and that includes mixed broadleaf and coniferous woodlands, grass and scrub. And their two main habitat requirements are 1, cover and shelter for denning, and 2, a reliable source of prey, and that's small mammals or rabbits. And small mammals form a major part of the diet, but rabbits are also preferred where they're available. And so that's really critical in terms of informing our understanding of wildcat ecology. And so just to talk a little bit about the decline of wildcats. So historically, the threats have primarily been hunting for sports and fur and persecution as vermin and habitat loss. And they went extinct from England and Wales by the late 1800s. And the rise of shooting in sports estates from 1800 onwards, and escalation of predator control. By the mid 1800s, wildcats were starting to become extinct, locally extinct, even in northern Scotland. And by the end of the 19th century, wildcats were nearly extinct, and they reached a population low point in around 1915, so around the time of the First World War. And after the First World War, populations began to expand due to reduced persecution, and that's really because of radical changes in the human populations. A lot of men were obviously very sadly lost, and so there was actually a reduction in persecution as a result of that, reforestation, and an increasing number of rabbits. And by the mid 20th century, there was there'd been a resurgence of wildcats, and the population reached a kind of recent peak, although it wasn't ever the extent to which we had previously. But then again, by the 60s and 70s, there was a decline. particularly as threats have been re-established. And probably also one of the things that's really critical to note is that persecution technology had improved considerably in these decades, and that will have probably played a considerable role. Legal protection of wildcats wasn't brought in until 1988, but it's important to note that the protection doesn't extend to the hybrids. Another threat that I've mentioned is hybridization, and we kind of say that this is really causing a cryptic extinction. And hybridization is interbreeding between the wildcat and the domestic cat, which, as I mentioned, was domesticated from Felis libica. And the offspring we know are viable and they're fertile. And the hybrids can breed with either parent species, we call this back crossing, or with each other. And I think the thing that's critical to note about hybridization is it's potentially been occurring since domestic cats arrived in Britain with the Romans, approximately 2,000 years ago. And extensive introgression and hybridization has led to difficulties in distinguishing Scottish wildcats from hybrids, and it complicates enforcement and enforcement and hinders monitoring and makes management potentially very challenging. And this is just a picture of some of the wildcat specimens that you can find in our museums. National Museum of Scotland and the Natural History Museum have quite big collections of historical wildcats, and you can note some of the difference in pelage and also some of the size difference. And what I'd say is, having been to visit some of these collections personally and sample cats for genetic testing, it's really very noticeable how big some of the historical wildcats are, and how good their pelage markings are, because that's one of the key identifying factors that has been used is to determine between the Scottish wildcat or the wildcat and the domestic cats. And Andrew Kitchener at the National Museum of Scotland actually developed a method looking at 7 principal pelage characteristics to distinguish the wildcat from feral domestic cat. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with these not showing up, sorry, the red's not showing up that well perhaps, but there's a number of different markings that are used. In fact, 7 primary characteristics in order to construct a pelage score. And this is a tool that's used extensively for determining the difference between wildcats and domestic cats and their hybrids, but also particularly where in cases where we can't use genetic testing. So we have also conducted quite a lot of genetic testing on wildcats in order to try and understand the situation around hybridization in a bit more detail. And we now know that although, as I mentioned, domestic cats have been around and in contact with our wild-living wildcat populations for a long time, genetic research shows that hybridization has actually escalated quite dramatically recently from the 1960s onwards. And the genetic research that we've conducted shows that Scotland really has what we call a hybrid swarm, or a complete genetic continuum between wildcats and domestic cats. Just to talk about that in a little bit more detail, before I launch into that, this is how we tend to depict genetic scores for wildcats. Each of these dots is a single cat, and how far up this axis it is shows you how much of a wildcat it is. So cats at this level here are very good genetic wildcats, and cats down at this level are not, and therefore domestic cats. And we use this hybrid score is constructed based on a number of different genetic markers, and we use this in order to determine genetically whether a cat is a wildcat or not. And as I said, you can't always do this in all circumstances. You have to have access to a genetic sample, and it has to be of a certain quality. And so it's a useful tool, but it's not a universally useful tool. And this genetic research has been conducted with the help of the laboratory at Edinburgh Zoo, the RZSS Wild Genes Laboratory, and over 500 cats have been analysed to date. And this is just kind of shows you the sort of how these scores fall out. So when we tested a data set of wildcats, which were actually collected from museum samples and gathered between 1890 and 1980, most of them came out as wildcats genetically, and this is our domestic cat reference sample set. These are a bunch of different data sets that have been collected in the past decades. RTA means road traffic accident, so these are all cats that have been handed into the National Museum of Scotland that are road traffic accident victims, and the vast majority of them are tabby looking cats. And what you can see is there is a genetic continuum between wildcat up here and domestic cat down here. And these are the cats that were targeted under a project called Scottish Wildcat Action, which I'm going to talk a bit more about in a moment, for trap, neuter, vaccinate, release. And again, you can see a real genetic continuum. And in fact, this did target cats that weren't wildcats, so we don't see any at the top here, but there's really an awful lot of hybrids. And these are cats that were targeted because based on camera trapping footage, they were thought to be wildcats. And those, again, they are all hybrids of some description. So really, the message is that there's an awful lot of hybridized individuals out there. Over the years, there's been lots of conservation and research and conservation action for wildcats, and this is just a slide kind of summarising a little bit of the history. So the first population census was in 1983. And really from the 1990s onwards, there was a lot of interest in research on wildcat behaviour, habitat use, the diets, the genetics and pelage that I've already talked about. And then people started, once people had done that research, or the community had done that research, people started to become concerned about things getting worse over time. And it wasn't really until 2010 with the Cairngorm Wildcat project or Highland Tiger that the first kind of really targeted conservation project happened. And that was based here locally in the Cairngorm National Park. And David Hetherington, who I'm sure many of you know, was the project officer for that project. And that really focused targeted conservation action within the Cairngorm National Park. And out of that project, the Scottish Wildcat Conservation Action Plan was developed, which was the first national plan which brought together government agencies and a variety of different stakeholders, conservation agents, conservation charities, in order to come up with a plan to try and recover wildcats. And out of that plan, Scottish Wildcat Action was born, which was a project designed at trying to reverse the decline of wildcats. And that project was focused in priority areas, areas that were found in a scoping survey and determined to be suitable areas for wildcat conservation. And the aim of that project was to halt the decline of wildcats within 5 years. I think everybody now admits that was far too ambitious. And there was also an ex situ strand of the project, which was ex situ conservation is captive conservation. In situ conservation is conservation in the field. And there was an ex situ strand of that project, which was around managing the captive population as a potential tool for future recovery. And during that side of the project, we didn't know that much about the captive population. All the cats were screened for hybridization. We constructed relatedness between them using a stud book, and we massively increased the capacity of the captive breeding population. I think at the starting point of the project, there were only around 70 individuals, and now there's 150. And so that was the kind of ex situ side. But in terms of what was happening in the field, the team that were working out in the field, who put a huge amount of work into the project, became increasingly concerned about how few wildcats they were finding. So it was very clear that when the team in the field went out to do the camera trapping and lots of work was done on trap, neuter, vaccinate, release, and we were testing samples in the lab, it was clear that there were really very few wildcats out there, and the cats that were out there were outnumbered, more than 3 to 1 in terms of feral domestic cats or feral hybrids. And so partway through the project, it was decided to try and bring in an independent body to kind of review the progress of the project. And the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature Species Survival Commission, Cat Specialist Group, it's a mouthful, was invited in to come and review the project. And for those of you that aren't familiar with the Species Survival Commission, there are a lot of different specialist groups that are appointed by the IUCN that really consist of kind of global specialists. So we're very lucky to have the Cat Specialist Group to come and review the project. And there's a publicly available report about that, but they concluded that the Scottish wildcat population was no longer viable. And what that means is that even if there are some individuals still in the wild, they're unable to form a self-sustaining population. And in short, the evidence show that there's too few cats, they're too widely dispersed and too hybridized to recover without outside help. So that was quite a depressing conclusion. And out of the advice in that report and their collective partnership, the Saving Wildcats project was born. And so this is the new latest phase of wildcat conservation in Scotland. And the Saving Wildcats project is a European partnership project. It's dedicated to conservation recovery, and we are aiming to prevent the extinction of wildcats by breeding and releasing them back into the wild. And there was a specific recommendation in the IUCN report that recovery would require releases of wildcats back into the wild, along with a number of other actions, which it's important to note and need to run alongside it. And obviously, at some rosy point in the future, we would like to see wildcats restored to landscapes across Scotland, and also for that to work in harmony with human populations. But we all acknowledge that we're a long way away from that. And I think anybody who's worked in conservation knows that it takes decades to recover species fully. So we're planning to be in this for the long haul. But in terms of the project itself, it runs from 2020 to 2026. And there's really two kind of arms of the project that come together. It's a project of two halves. So in the first half of the project, those two arms are kind of separate. So one arm is what we call the in situ side of the project, or the field side of the project. And that's all about trying to understand everything to do with the release site and improve everything to do with the release site before the cats are released. And then there's the ex situ or conservation breeding side of the project, which is about preparing the cats that are going out into the wild. And then those two things are going to come together, and the year for that is 2023. So that's this year, and they're going to come together into a trial release. Cats are going to be moved out into the wild, and that's going to be monitored very intensively, and there will be lots of learning from that, and then that will feed into other rounds of releases. This is a project partnership, so many partners from the Scottish Wildcat Action Partnership. The project is led by the organisation that I work for, RZSS, and is working in partnership with Cairngorm National Park Authority, Nature Scotland, Forestry and Land Scotland here in Scotland. Importantly, though, we are drawing on international expertise as well, and we have two international partners Junta de Andalucía in Spain, and they are the lead for the Iberian Lynx Reintroduction Project, which is one of the most successful carnivore reintroduction projects that's happened globally, and we are learning a lot from their approach, different species, but lots of the same challenges. And Northern Zark in Sweden, that are another conservation breeding facility, and providing us with lots of expertise. And as I said, a project like this isn't possible without a team, and this is the fantastic team that we have. And some of the beady-eyed amongst you may have noticed that I am not Keri Langridge, who was originally billed to be speaking here. So Keri unfortunately couldn't be here, but Keri is our in situ manager and lead ecologist. And she has a team of people, Lou, Alex, Lara and Jamie, who some of you may have met, and Lara is actually in the audience. You can wave. So if anyone has any questions for the Zero team afterwards, thanks Lara, I'm going to put her on the spot. And then the ex situ side of the team is run by David Barclay, who some of you may know, and we have a team of expert keepers, Alex, Rachel, Estelle and Sandra, who are working on everything to do with managing the wildcats. And then various other people in the team, Ian, Helena, Claudia, who's also here, thank you Claudia, and Alice, who work in a variety of ways supporting the project. And there's a lot of different expertise that goes into running projects. And in terms of the management group for the overall project, there's some people that I'm sure some of you are familiar with as well. So, and we're drawing on a lot of different people internationally, both in the realm of field ecology and also conservation breeding to help advise us, because it's certainly a challenging project. So I talked a little bit about the overall structure of the project. I'm going to go through now in a little bit more detail on some of the different aspects of it. So this is the first side, which is the conservation breeding side. So in order to deliver on conservation breeding, we've established the first large-scale dedicated conservation breeding for release centre for wildcats in the UK. Our aim is to breed wildcats and prepare them for a challenging life in the wild, and life in the wild is challenging for all carnivores, so we're taking that job very seriously. We've got 8 breeding pairs from the UK's conservation breeding programme, which actually comprises over 30 zoos and wildcats across zoos and wildlife parks across the UK. We've taken 8 breeding pairs of wildcats from that captive breeding population, and the pairs are bred in the imaginatively named breeding enclosures, and these are the enclosures here that you can see here. They're not greenhouses. They do look a little bit like greenhouses, but they're not. That's mesh, not glass, and these are the breeding enclosures for the wildcats. Once the wildcats are born, the kittens are then moved into larger pre-release enclosures at the age of around 5 to 6 months, i.e. just prior to release. And we're taking, in terms of the design of the centre and the approach to animal husbandry and care, we're taking a lot of information from, as I mentioned, the Iberian lynx centres in Portugal and Spain, which have used this approach very successfully to breed and release Iberian lynx for a number of years. So just to give you a little bit of an overview of the breeding centre, this is the back. So hopefully many of you are familiar with the Highland Wildlife Park. This is the back of the Highland Wildlife Park. This is down here, you can see the drive-through bit that you might be familiar with. And at the moment we're flying over the breeding enclosures. This was taken last summer. And we are just heading over the site that is the yet to be constructed on pre-release enclosure area. So that was at this point last summer. Just another view, because it's so nice and snowy. This is us moving over the same breeding centre. So we've got 8 different enclosures, 4 pairs of enclosures, where the breeding pairs of cats are housed. And one of the really important features about the breeding centre is the ability to have good biosecurity. So this is a biosecure fence here, and there's a kind of biosecure entrance that the keepers enter and change all their clothes and their boots and things like that before they come into the breeding centre. And then over here, you can just see this is the area where the pre-release enclosures are constructed, and up here, and those are much larger open-topped naturalistic enclosures. And so those are enclosures where the cats are being moved to. And obviously, a really key feature of this site is it's in great habitat, and it's in a very quiet location, and people paying visitors to the zoo and don't go here. It's what we call off show, and that's a really key feature to the site. And there's various other precautions as well that we take, like using electric vehicles around the site and things like that. In terms of what's happening inside the breeding enclosures, or hopefully some breeding. This is just a footage of some of our cats. And the aim of the game is to produce kittens, and by having this set up, we get to see lots of lovely pictures like this. We aim to deliver really best practice animal husbandry with veterinary care and managing the diet of the animals, monitoring and recording their behaviour, being able to really study everything around animal introductions and reintroduction, and providing really great enrichment. And one of the great things about having this closer view of the cats is that we're able to learn and see lots of interesting things about them. So this is some information that our keeping team are gathering about the breeding behaviours, and this is what is technically called lordosis, but is also known as cat working. So this is a female presenting herself to a male who's on the other side of the fence. And also learning lots of information about pregnancy. We can see much more detail than even in traditional zoo setups. And really within the pre-release enclosures, the philosophy is to have a much more distanced approach to animal management. So within the breeding enclosures, we have some level of regular human contact. We want the cats to be relaxed, and we want to be able to deliver them the best animal care. We want them to be relaxed in human presence. In the pre-release enclosures, there's much less human visitation, and we're really trying to dehabituate them to the presence of humans. They're much larger and more natural enclosures than the breeding enclosures. And in order to look in on what's happening in the pre-release enclosures, we have a very extensive CCTV monitoring setup in order to be able to look in on what's happening within these enclosures. And this is a picture of David Barclay looking at some of the CCTV footage. And yes, we get to learn a lot about the whole idea really of the approach is to learn as much as we can about the individual cat's behaviours before they go out into the wild, and ensure that they're exhibiting natural behaviour. So heading to the other wing of the project, the in situ side of the project. The objectives of the in situ side of the project are to assess the release site, to prepare the release site, and to monitor the release. So not much really, a huge amount. And really, in terms of assessing the release site, the team have been reassessing the release site, which is an area within wider Badenoch-on-Strathspey Bay, and that includes conducting biological feasibility, ecological feasibility assessment, and socio-economic feasibility assessments. And those are things that formed part of our translocation licence application, which is the kind of legal process we have to go through in order to receive a release licence. The field team are also conducting threat mitigation, including trap neuter vaccinate release of feral cats, landowner engagement and community engagement. And when it comes to monitoring the release, the team will be trying to learn everything possible we can about the individual cats that are released, including collaring the cats, camera trapping, continuous monitoring of other species, including prey and other small carnivores, and dietary analysis of the released animals through scat analysis. So that's a kind of general overview. And in a little bit more detail, so in terms of assessing the habitat suitability, suitable habitats of forest, grassland and scrub habitats, as I mentioned, are the kind of complex mixture of edge habitats, and high or wet ground is not suitable. And this covers the suitable habitat, which is essentially the lowland forested areas of the landscape, covers around 220 square kilometres of the release site, and has high surrounding connectivity, to surrounding habitat. And why the release in the CMP, historically the Cairngorm National Park has been a key site in the wildcat range and was considered one of the last strongholds for the species. And there's also relatively few landowners in the specific site that we've chosen, which have conservation objectives. And much of the land, one of the other really important points is much of the land in this area is also legally protected. In terms of the ecological surveys and monitoring that the field team are conducting, they're doing camera trap surveys, looking for wild living cats, prey species, competing small or meso carnivores and other protected species. And they're also doing dedicated prey surveys for small mammals, water voles and rabbits. And in year one of the project, which was the winter of 20 to 2021, they did an extensive baseline survey, and that's being followed up now every year by annual monitoring. So the annual winter, as I said, the annual winter survey started in 2020, and it's a standardised, so there's a large camera trap array that's deployed across the release site, so the prospective release site, so there's approximately 100 camera traps at any one time. It's a standard wildcat survey design that's actually been used extensively, was used extensively in the Scottish Wildcat Action Project. The camera stations are baited with valerian root, and they are recording abundance and distribution of all detected species across the site. And as I said, initially we started with the winter surveys, but the surveys are now of some form are now continuously going on throughout the year. And the field team wanted just to share a bit of the details of the image management with you, because we know there's actually a lot of people that run their own camera traps in the local area, and we have hundreds of thousands of images, and we're using a piece of software called DigiCam, which was actually designed by the Zoological Society of London in order to do this classification. And it's a way of really basically tagging all the individuals with, the species name and the number of individuals and the camera number and landowner, and it's a really good way of being able to kind of classify all the many hundreds of thousands of images that we get. And this is a really, really big job for the field team. They spend a lot of time doing after the surveys. Once we've got that data, we can do lots of interesting analyses with it. This is an occupancy analysis, and it shows that actually most of the 90% of the survey grids are occupied by pine martens. Amazingly, 50% of the survey grids are occupied by dogs, and only 5% of the survey grids are occupied by domestic or hybrid cats. And so that's a really good, that's actually really good news from the perspective of the threat from hybridisation. We can also use this data analysis to help look at some distribution maps to help identify hotspots of carnivore activity or prey or human disturbance, and look at the number of each of these, the size of these blobs corresponds to the number of detection events within 100 days, with one detection event being no return within an hour, so it's sort of a time window of an hour, and that's really useful to get a good understanding of what else is going on. And we're doing a lot of this work in collaboration with the Cairngorm Connect Predator Project, who are also gathering lots of camera trap information across the site. And one of the great advantages of this site is there's lots and lots of information out there. It's been well studied, and so we're able to really kind of look at the impacts of the release over time and the things that might be impacting the release over time. The field team are doing rabbit surveys. Rabbits are an important prey species for many generalist predators, but we know that wildcats favour them when they're available. Populations have undergone really significant declines in recent decades, and we know that wildcat distribution is positively correlated with rabbit presence, and so there's work going on to map all of the warren systems across the release site. And really importantly, we're working with the Cairngorm Connect Predator Project to carry out small mammal surveys. So these have been carried out since 2017, and looking at bank voles and wood mice using live trapping methods and field vole abundance using vole sign indices. And this is just some trends in field vole abundance over the last few years, and has shown that they fluctuate on a 3 to 4 year cycle. And we're hoping that 2023, the year of the releases, could potentially be a vole high. That would be useful. The field team are also conducting water vole surveys. So although there is limited evidence for wildcats predating water voles in Scotland, we believe that they could possibly be an opportunistic prey source, especially on higher ground in the summer. And so the team are recording annual summer transects, recording field signs, and the results suggest a relatively stable population with 25% of the suitable habitat occupied by water voles. A really important part of the camera trap survey is to look at wild living cats, and camera trapping suggests that there's very low numbers of feral or hybrid domestic cats at the release site, and that the cats are mainly concentrated around farms or the edge of human settlements. And local social surveys that the field team are carrying out have identified most of the cats as owned pet cats, most of the cats that we are detecting. And the cats are recorded in the hilariously named catalogue and closely monitored. And really what the catalogue is us trying to understand every single cat that moves within the release site. And so information is stored on the ownership status, the known location, the sex, the neutering status, its pelage and genetic scores if they're available, and a variety of other things. And this is just a kind of a picture of the database that we've built up of all the different cats that live out there. And so just a little bit more about trap neuter. So any cats that we believe to be unneutered are targeted for trap, neuter, vaccinate, return. And that's the national strategy. It's a national approach for feral cat control for wildcat conservation. Small healthy populations of neutered and vaccinated feral cats might actually, in fact, help to protect wildcats from hybridization by maintaining stable territories and keeping unneutered feral cats out. TNVR also obviously reduces hybridization, but the vaccination approach also reduces disease transfer to wildcats, which is something that I've not mentioned, but we also know that a significant threat from domestic cats is the transmission of disease. and it's an internationally recognised method of humane feral cat control, and it's a method that we carry out under licence from Nature Scot. And just a little bit more detail about the approach, because just to illustrate the kind of care that we're taking around this. So the Saving Wildcats field team officers are using local on-the-ground communication and camera trap surveys to identify cats. So there's a lot of work that goes into that before a cat is targeted for trapping for TNVR. And once the field team are happy that the cat is feral and neutered, they place a cat-specific trap baited with either food or a valerian root lure out. All cats are labelled with the Saving Wildcats contact details, so if you happen to come across one, you'll know if that's ours. We trap overnight, and there's a strict protocol about the length of time that a cat is allowed to be within the trap. If successful, the cat will be transferred to Highland Wildlife Park to our dedicated veterinary facility, where the vets will check for a microchip, as that's a legal sign of cat ownership. And if no microchip is found, a full health check and neutering and vaccination is carried out. And all TNVR cats are given a 1 centimetre left ear tip removal, as this is an international symbol that a cat has been previously neutered and prevents further unnecessary trapping, which is really important for welfare reasons. And a few hours later, once the vets are happy with the cat recovery, the field officers will return the cat to where it was trapped. And a bowl of food is left where they're released for them to find later. And this is just a video of that happening. This is Laura, who's here, releasing the cat. And we're really grateful that we're working very closely with Cats Protection on the strategy for TNVR. Cats Protection are obviously also carrying out lots of TNVR in the local area. So there's lots of challenges around TNVR. There's a lot of time spent identifying owned pet cats versus feral and unowned cats, and that takes time and a lot of effort in terms of the camera trapping. The team take a lot of precautions to avoid trapping pet cats. And the ownership is checked on any trapped cat. And it really illustrates one of the importance of microchipping, because it's one of the really clear signs that a cat is owned. And so we, in terms of the responsible cat ownership messaging for the project, we really encourage everybody that the best way to protect their cat from disease and to have unwanted kittens is to neuter, vaccinate and microchip your cats and make it a super cat. And there's that's our campaign material or our engagement material that we deliver as part of the project, and is a consistent message that was also delivered under Scottish Wildcat Action. And just to illustrate responsible cat ownership, this is some of our team being responsible cat owners. There's a lot of cat lovers in our team, as you can probably imagine. Just a few other activities that we've been doing. A big part of our work is to do community engagement. Our community engagement began in 2020, which was quite challenging because we were under COVID lockdown. So we held a number of webinars, and we also conducted a postcard drop across all of the project area, which linked to a questionnaire about responsible cat ownership and restoration and wildcat restoration in the wider area. And on the whole, responses were positive, and a lot of that information fed into our application for the translocation license that forms part of the permission for release. And what I should say is that our community engagement and surveys are far from over, and we're always keen to hear people's viewpoints about everything to do with cat ownership and wildcat conservation. Helena Parsons, who's not here, but she's our outreach and engagement officer, and she really leads on pulling all that information together. And talking to the local communities is a really, really important part of our project. We've held a variety of different outreach and engagement events,
we're keen to do that as much as possible, whether that's farmers markets or hosting visits of local schools to the Highland Wildlife Park, attending Highland Games, etc. And if there's an event that you would like us to attend or speak at, then please get in touch. We'd love to help, and we'd love to be there and explain more about the project. And it's really important to us as well that we know there's lots of really important cultural links to wildcats in the local area, and we're very keen to build on those and work with local businesses, particularly on trying to promote those. We're also conducting, this is led by Lou in the field team, social surveys with our landowners. We've run drop-in sessions and we've done informal interviews with more than 50 local landowners at the release site and in the wild project area. That's really been really helpful to help us identify concerns around identification, predation of ground nesting birds and predator control activity. It's clear that there's still an ongoing risk to wildcats from predator control activity, and it's really important to keep that communication going and awareness raising to minimise risks. So in terms of those two sides of the project coming together, as I mentioned, 2023 is now the year for the trial release, and that's going to start in the summer. And the strategy for the release is what we call a soft release or a delayed release, where cats will be placed out they will be taken from the pre-release enclosures and placed in smaller enclosures within the release site before being released. We're planning to do the releases between June and September. That's the peak of prey availability and the lowest chance of road mortality. Every single cat that's released will be collared, and at this point the cats are old enough to take collars, because that's actually a constraint in terms of releasing cats at specific ages. So they'll be old enough to take GPS collars, and there's going to be several release cohorts, but we're aiming to release in the region of 20 cats this summer. And post-release monitoring is really super important. So using GPS collars, camera traps, and a variety of other information. This use of GPS collars is something that's been trialled actually previously under Scottish Wildcat Action. The team have got some experience of doing this previously, and the data is stored on the collars and then it is manually downloaded once you have to get within a certain distance of the collar, and then it can be manually downloaded. And we anticipate that we'll be able to track the cats for up to 9 months. And as I said, this will be run concurrently with a variety of other monitoring actions, for example, the camera trapping in case collars fall off or stop working, which is a sort of inevitable part of this kind of work. So we hope to release 20 wildcats in 2023, and then we'll be releasing 20 more in 24 and another 20 in 25. And we will be aiming to learn as much as possible about what happens to these guys when they are released into the wild, in order to understand whether the wildcat population is successfully established at the release site, which is, of course, the aim of the project. So that's really all from me. I'd just like to thank, before I finish, all of our supporters. There's a huge number of people that have been extremely supportive of the project. And as I said, it takes a big team to do a project like this. We've also had loads of volunteers help us in a whole variety of ways, most recently helping to finish off the construction of the pre-release enclosures. And if you're interested in finding out more or helping us, then you can sign up to our newsletter. Hopefully some of you are already members of it, and you can speak to Claudia, who will be standing there and will help you sign up if you'd like to. If you're a co-op member, you can support the project with your purchase, and we've got a programme where you can sponsor wildcats, and anything else that you'd like to do, please just get in touch. So thank you so much for listening. It's been lovely to talk to you. Yeah, happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much.
fantastic. Very detailed and in-depth. And just the amount of work that goes in to over such a protracted period. Fantastic, fascinating. Open for questions if anybody. I mean, the question I had you early on, I think you said 220 square kilometres, or what the area that a cat requires.
No, that's
So
the size of the release site.
Okay.
Or
So
the
how
size
many-
of the wildcat habitat within the release site.
Okay, but you said they're quite individual as well. They isolate and sort of live by themselves apart from the breeding time.
Yes.
So how many cats could an area of that size accommodate?
Well, that is a very important question. And in terms of the original estimates that went into the construction of the wildcat priority areas, which was selected as the wildcat sites for conservation, the estimate was that they needed to hold a population of 40 cats in order to have a population that had a chance of being viable over 50 years. And so in terms of selection of the release site, we've used that calculation in order to choose a release site of a suitable size. What we don't actually know until we do the releases is really truly what the carrying capacity will be. So obviously that, you can do a lot of this modelling, and we've done a lot of habitat modelling, we've done population viability modelling, but until we actually really attempt to re-establish this, we won't know, what the carrying capacity is.
If the water voles suddenly take a dip.
Yeah, but it's been chosen to have to be of an appropriate size that it would be able to establish a population. And also another important feature of the site is it has good connectivity to other sites as well.
And you're not specifically mentioning where the site is that?
Well, it's in this general area,
so
but
this-
we aren't
I can
officially
understand.
announcing that just yet. We might be doing that soon.
Okay.
Yes.
Good. Other question? Yes, Peter.
When you come to a release area, do you release one at a time or a group of them? And how do you get genetic diversity in a release area?
That's a really good question. So the strategy is going to be to release small groups of cats together. Obviously we're going to try and choose those cats to not be all completely closely related in terms of the cohort of 20 cats that we're releasing. And we've done a lot of genetic analysis in order to assess that. But the reality is in the short term, the very short term, the genetic diversity is probably not the most important factor. And once we see what cats establish successfully in the release site, then we'll release other cats, to kind of be complementary to that. And that's the strategy that we took, for example, with the beaver release in Knapdale. Probably, I guess Sod's law is that, we'll find that it's a bunch of related cats that will all establish together early on, and then we'll add some more cats in to try and increase the genetic diversity. That's probably just, predicting what might happen. But that genetic management is something that's very important for the long term, but in the short term is less of a priority. Yeah.
Is I take it you did genetic testing on the breeding pairs that you have.
Mm-hmm.
Did they return 100% wildcat?
No. So we're really clear about that. So we've never stated, never said that the breeding population is free of hybridization. Probably, if you noticed on my graph, the bar is sort of set at 75%. So we accept cats into the breeding program that we're very certain are better than 75% in terms of their genetic score. And that's just it's kind of a pragmatic approach, because if we're too restrictive, then what we do is sort of at the other end of the spectrum is inbreed the population. So we accept that there's a certain level of hybridization. Yeah.
You mentioned valerian several times. Is that the same as catnip? Why do cats like valerian?
Laura, why do cats like valerian?
I think it's like a stronger version of catnip.
Is it? Okay.
And I think the science says usually around 2/3 of cats have a valerian response.
Okay.
It makes it kind of revolve around rather than below, so you get good like large photos from every angle. So it's quite good.
Just for the benefit of people on YouTube who might not have heard that, the question was about valerian and whether it's the same as or similar to catnip, and I think the answer was yes.
Stronger version.
A stronger version.
Yeah,
So
and
more addictive.
it's used commonly as a tool. It's always been used commonly as a tool in wildcat conservation. It's used a lot in Europe as well. And the response is feeling the response is genetic, and that so we're actually recording how our cats respond to valerian.
Yeah. Okay.
Could you say something about the legal frameworks surrounding the release of wildcats? You mentioned predator control being a concern for some landowners. So how would that play out?
The legal controls around releasing of the wildcats.
So it's illegal, as I said, wildcats are protected by law, so it's illegal to shoot a wildcat, but of course feral cat control is legal. So the thing that's very tricky in terms of wildcat conservation is distinguishing between wildcats and hybrids. And so the advice is that if in doubt, if it's a tabby cat, is not to shoot it, and in fact the advice that's generally been issued by the Wildcat project is to do cage trapping in order to be able to identify a cat in a trap.
Are you aware if there's been any prosecutions for?
Not recently. I think that and I think this is always been one of the tricky areas around wildcat conservation is distinguishing between feral cats and wildcats.
So the Wildlife Police Service will be aware of this as a potential issue.
Yeah, I mean we have good collaboration with the wildlife crime officers here, and they're aware of the project. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Have you ever been pleasantly surprised with the ones you've trapped? You found any like 75%
we've not trapped any cats within the lifespan of this project that have been wildcats. There have in the Scottish Wildcat Action Project, cats were trapped that were wildcats. Yeah, that had more than 75%.
Yeah.
You seem quite relaxed about the fact that 95% of the areas have got pine marten. Does that mean that you don't regard pine marten as a potential threat to young wildcats, presumably?
So a point about the camera trap study that the data of which I presented is that we did bait all of the stations. So the approach for wildcat camera trapping in general has been to use baited stations. So it's possible that that's actually inflating the pine marten detection. So that's one thing to point out. In terms of the interactions between the sort of whole guild of mesocarnivores, that's something we don't know that much about. And it's actually a really good reason for releasing into this area because it's very well studied to try and understand all of those interactions in a bit more detail.
Yes.
What does success look like in terms of population establishment and growth in your trial areas over the next 5, 10, 20 years? Yeah,
so that's a really good question. So, I mean, ultimately, in medium term, success would be to establish a viable population. That's a population that's able to survive, I guess, independently over a period of time. In the short term, the success criteria are that we have survival of cats, that we detect reproduction, and that we have absence of hybridization. And those are the kind of short-term success criteria.
Yeah. And for a lot of the presentation, I was thinking this is never going to work because of hybridization. There's so many feral cats there. But then you came up with a statistic that in your release areas, less than 5% a very small number. So actually, did that surprise you, or were you expecting that?
I think the release site, that was one of the reasons why the release site's been chosen, but I think we've got to be honest, there's no perfect. I mean, life is challenging in the wild for carnivores. There's a reason why wildcats have declined, and there's nowhere that's perfect for them. And wildcats will move from beyond the release site. And so really, we've got to focus our efforts on the smaller area and then try and move that outwards. But I think hopefully a big, you've got a big sense that there's a lot of unknowns, and that everything we're going to be doing in terms of this project is about learning and in trying to improve for the next stage of wildcat conservation.
Just a question about the length of the project. Presumably it lines up with the commitment from your funders to fund it for that same length of the project, does it?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And you probably might be surprised as to why we even got EU funding for a project like this. So we applied in pretty much the last opportunity to get funding out of the LIFE programme before, unfortunately, we're now no longer eligible. So that's great, and a big part of our work is to make sure we put in a sustainable funding stream in order to continue the actions beyond the timeframe of the project, because we know from conservation projects globally and our efforts here in Scotland that you can't restore a species within a couple of years. That's completely unrealistic, and I wouldn't want to kind of stand here and pretend that was the case. So that's a big part of our plan. So yeah, anyone who can help on that front, we'd love to hear from you.
Great to talk about money, but when you've got such a sophisticated and a range of kind of partners and staff, it takes a big financial commitment, I imagine, to keep that going.
Yeah, so the total project budget is over £5 million. It's a lot of money. It's a huge amount of money. I think that's why I said this is a 1 minute to midnight type solution. It's not a solution that will generally favour for most species. I think, obviously, like a lot of projects, in the early phases, you have to do a lot of learning and setting things up. And we don't anticipate that the running of a project over time will be quite of that scale of funding. But yes, it's not cheap. So I think there's really any getting away from that. So that's why it's really important to have a kind of sustainable approach. On the plus side, I think there's lots of positives around that. We're providing some great jobs for people in the course of doing that, and there's but yeah, there's no getting away from the fact that it's expensive.
Thank you.
Yes. Alarm at the back.
Just out in the 1950s in Glenesk, I met a wildcat, and it wasn't happy to see me. It spat at me, and I wasn't happy to see it. What happens if 20 wildcats appear in front of me?
I think probably it's unlikely that people will see the cats that we release. It's actually one of the pieces of messaging that we want to. We don't want people to think that they're likely to see wildcats, because I think it's very unlikely. And wildcats are not dangerous animals. They are very feisty, and our keepers do tell us about that. They all say that they've got more fight in them than some of the slightly larger cat species, but fundamentally they're not dangerous to humans. And it's the most likely outcome is that a cat will you won't see it, or it'll run away and hide.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
You talked about the £5 million in the period of the project. With any project, you've always got an exit strategy. So where's your exit strategy at the end of the period?
and how you're dovetailing all the work you're doing into other projects.
Yes.
Sustainability.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of captive breeding for conservation, it's really important to have an exit strategy because you know, if you're going out and doing, you know, surveys in the wild or management interventions in the wild, generally speaking, you can sort of walk away from them eventually. But obviously, if you've got living animals, we'll still be looking after wildcats at the end of the project. I mean, saying that, we've been looking after wildcats for decades at RZSS. This is obviously a different scale, but so in terms of the breeding of the species, that has to be, we can only breed once we know we've got places and funding to release cats. So that's a really important part of the planning, and we do have an exit strategy around that. Obviously, we believe in order to re-establish wildcat populations successfully across Scotland, it's likely that we will need to carry on release activities, not just at a single site, but probably at other sites as well. There's also lots of discussion, as you're probably aware, about wildcat reintroductions in other parts of the UK, and you know, we're hoping to be, we're aiming as a project to be very collaborative in the course of those plans coming online. So I think, you know, that's sort of a long-winded answer. We don't know at the moment what I guess the next decade is going to bring, but I think there's lots of potential for this project to be helping wildcat restoration in a variety of forms in the future.
Okay.
You say 75% pure and above is what you'll lead with. In the projected future, what do you estimate that the figure would be? Obviously, be more than 75, better than 75% because of the rest.
Yeah, we don't know. I mean, one part of the plan that we would like to do in future is probably bring some wildcats from the rest of Europe as well to join the releases, and so that would obviously also offer the potential to improve the situation. But generally speaking, we're not trying to be too stringent with that, because as long as we can establish a wildcat population with kind of good genetic scores, then in the long run they'll have the raw material and the kind of genetic diversity to hopefully become a healthy adaptable wildcat population. And we don't want to be too, as I said, too restricted in terms of then creating inbreeding.
Just one last one for me. In terms of landowners who you've had to negotiate with, have you had any resistance? And if so, what have been their concerns or their reservations?
We've had really positive engagement, as I mentioned, the team, and I mean, this is really credit to the field team. They've been out and spoken to lots of different landowners, and if there's any landowners in the audience here that we haven't spoken to them, of course we would like to do that. But generally speaking, people have been very supportive. I think there's definitely concerns around potential conflict in terms of some land management activities around game birds and feral cat control, and the field team are engaging on a whole set of conversations with. We're actually running a workshop around that with a number of different gamekeepers in the coming weeks in order to discuss that in a bit more detail. But on the whole, I think people have been very supportive.
Well, I have to ask this as well, given our subject for our last talk. Do wildcats pose a threat to capercaillie?
Yeah, so we had to, in order to obtain the release license, we had to do an extensive amount of work into something called an HRA, which looks at the impact on protected species. And really what that involved was a big kind of literature review of all the existing literature on that. And there's very little evidence that wildcats predate capercaillie. As we mentioned, their predominant prey source is small mammals, and also they don't share the same habitat. So wildcats prefer a kind of forest edge mixed habitat, whereas the capercaillie tend to be found in the centre of coniferous forests. So whilst the potential is clearly there, we think that it's very low, and that's been evaluated by obviously Nature Scott. But as I said, an important part of this project is monitoring, and that's certainly one of the aspects that we'll be monitoring.
Any final questions? No? I think,
yes,
yes,
I've got
one.
a question for you. If you're releasing a few wildcats together, what do you expect them to survive on if you've been feeding them beforehand? Because the capper are dying, white, there's hardly any more white hairs. So what are they going to survive on?
What the wildcat are going to
Yes.
survive on?
Yes.
So that's why we've been doing, well, small mammals and rabbits. So
There's not many rabbits around here nowadays.
yeah, so that we know that that's a challenge. So the small mammal populations, so that's what we anticipate the key prey will be, and that's the reason for doing all of the baseline assessments. So we're not, as I just mentioned, we're not anticipating that they're going to predate on capercaillie.
Okay, that clearly is a big unknown and a big risk, though, isn't it? And I guess the first winter will be a really crucial period.
Yeah. And life is challenging in the world.
Yeah, you've said that a few times. Yeah, absolutely understood. Okay. Well, thank you so much. That's been really informative, really interesting, and we'll watch with interest to see. It'd be good to catch up with you in a year or so's time to see how the releases are going. So thank you so much.
I'm sure we'll be happy to come back. Yeah.
At least we can do.
Oh gosh.
And Claudia's here as well.
Very kind. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's been great. Thank you all for coming along. That's it for this season. That's our season finished. But we will be back again in October. We've already got a raft of great speakers lined up for next year. So please stick with us. If you haven't got your name on our email list and would like to get information about next year's programme, there's on the table here, just leave your name and email address for us and we'll put you onto our mailing list. And also, just to repeat, there's also a paper there to sign if you want to get the Wildcat newsletters. So thank you all very much. See you in October. Thank you. That was brilliant.
Thank you very much for inviting us to speak. I'm sure we'll be happy.